My name is Eleanor Kessler. I am 67. I have always prided myself on being careful with money, a habit formed over decades as an accountant and reinforced through quiet, disciplined living. Mornings in my Charleston apartment usually begin with a cup of tea and the soft light spilling across my kitchen counter. But today felt different. My phone buzzed insistently on the counter, a sharp contrast to the usual quiet hum of dawn. The notification made my stomach lurch. Bank alert, $80,000 gone. My first thought was a mistake, an error in the system. Banks make mistakes, I reminded myself, though the cold knot of unease tightened anyway. My hands shook slightly as I opened the app, scrolling through the transactions. And then the truth hit me like a slap. Every charge, meticulously recorded, traced to Dubai, and the recipient, my daughter Lila's father-in-law. I sank onto the kitchen chair, gripping the counter edge. I had imagined emergencies before, of course. Small things like a forgotten bill or a misdirected payment. But nothing of this scale. $80,000 was more than my retirement cushion. More than I had ever spent on myself in a lifetime. My chest felt tight. I tried to breathe, forcing in shallow gulps of air while my mind raced. I stared at the screen again, my disbelief curdling into something colder betrayal. Lila, my only child, the one I had taught to value integrity and responsibility, had used my card without permission. She had taken my life savings and turned it into a lavish trip for a man she barely tolerated, the father of her husband. I felt the old blend of anger and heartbreak rise like bile in my throat. My eyes darted to the calendar on the fridge. Reminders of the week ahead, bills already scheduled to withdraw. The room seemed suddenly too small, too silent, except for the distant hum of early morning Charleston. I needed to figure out the extent of the damage, to understand if there was any way to fix this before it was too late. I picked up the phone again, hesitating over her number. I needed answers. Though I feared the ones I might hear, my fingers hovered above the call button, and then, with a deep shudder, I pressed. The line rang endlessly, unanswered. I spent the next hour hovering over my phone, dialing the bank again and again, each ring stretching my nerves thinner. A polite voice on the other end repeated assurances that they would investigate. But the words felt hollow. I asked them to review every transaction from the past month, hoping, foolishly, that this was some technical error, a misplaced decimal, or a system glitch. Yet each line on the statement confirmed what I had already seen: $80,000 vanished and sent to accounts tied to Dubai. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself that mistakes happen, that perhaps someone at the bank would call back and correct everything before the panic in my chest became unbearable. I even checked my emails, scanning for any notification of fraud alerts I might have missed, anything that could justify this nightmare as accidental. Then I called Lila, my only daughter. I imagined her voice soft and reassuring, a bridge back to normalcy. But the phone clicked through to voicemail again and again. Finally, after several attempts, she picked up, her tone clipped and almost rehearsed. "Mom, I'm busy," she said, the words brushing past me like an indifferent wind. "I'll call you later." Later never came. Each unanswered call, each vague excuse, chipped away at my hope. Part of me wanted to believe she hadn't done it, that she would explain some misunderstanding, a transaction coded incorrectly, or a friend borrowing her card for a moment. But as I sat on the edge of my armchair, staring at the empty kitchen table, a creeping dread settled in. The weight of realization pressed down slowly, stubbornly. Maybe this wasn't a glitch. Maybe this was deliberate. And the thought, the one I had refused to let surface in the quiet of my apartment, made my stomach twist in anger and fear alike. I sank back into the chair, phone in hand, waiting for some miracle call that might never come. The next morning, the bank called back. A young woman on the line spoke with a careful tone, explaining that they had compiled a detailed record of every transaction. I listened, gripping the edge of the counter as the numbers tumbled out charges for private jets, five-star hotels, designer shopping, each one traced to Dubai, each one made in my name but without my consent. My heart thudded heavily against my ribs as the reality sank deeper. I printed the statement, stacking the pages on the kitchen table. My eyes scanned each line, trying to reconcile the calm, dependable daughter I had raised with the audacious, reckless figure these records painted. And then the truth became undeniable. Lila had cloned my card. She had taken the money I had saved carefully, every penny accounted for over decades, and funneled it into a trip for her father-in-law, the man she barely spoke to except for occasional polite dinners. The anger hit first. A sharp, hot flare that made my hands tremble. How could she do this? How could someone I had nurtured, guided, and trusted for 40 years make choices that endangered my home and my stability? The betrayal twisted deeper when I realized it was deliberate, thought out, and executed without hesitation. Tears blurred my vision, not from sorrow alone, but from the combination of grief, disbelief, and the raw sting of personal violation. I had taught her about responsibility, the value of money, the importance of integrity. I had believed those lessons had taken root, and now, in one calculated sweep, they had been ignored, mocked, and exploited. I called Lila again, my voice shaking as I tried to keep control. She answered, her tone casual, almost dismissive. "Mom, it's not what you think," she said, brushing past my questions as if I were a nuisance. But I knew it was exactly what I thought. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding. Only a betrayal that cut deeper than any financial loss could. I sank into the chair, clutching the printout. The numbers blurred as anger and heartbreak collided inside me. Every dollar, every transaction was a reminder of trust broken. I forced myself to breathe, trying to focus on what needed to happen next. I had to act, to protect what remained of my life, and to confront the reality I had once refused to accept. The long day ahead promised answers, but also a reckoning I was not yet ready to fully face. The weight of yesterday's revelation followed me like a shadow into the morning. Rent was due, utilities were pending, and the phone seemed to ring endlessly with automated overdraft notices. Each alert felt like a hammer against my chest. I had always managed my finances meticulously. Every payment planned, every dollar accounted for, and now it felt as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. I dialed my landlord first, hesitating as the line connected. "Mr. Dalton, there's been an incident with my bank account," I began, my voice wavering. I tried to keep the explanation brief, to focus on facts rather than emotion. But his sharp gaze and clipped questions made my chest tighten. He listened, nodding but unmoved, and agreed to a partial extension. But his tone reminded me that leniency had limits. Next came the phone calls to friends I trusted, the ones who might offer temporary support. Each conversation felt like peeling back a layer of dignity I had worked decades to preserve. I hated asking, hated revealing that my own daughter had spent $80,000 without permission. And yet, the reality demanded it. A few offered kind words, a promise to help if needed, but even their sympathy was tempered by the quiet understanding that responsibility ultimately rested with me. I sat at my kitchen table, the bank statements still spread before me like an accusatory mosaic. The total of $80,000 seemed almost surreal, the sum too large to absorb easily. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. I imagined the luxury hotels, the private transfers, the extravagant dinners in Dubai, each dollar gone, leaving only a gnawing void in my carefully constructed life. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in with the weight of financial instability. I walked from room to room, touching familiar surfaces, as if to reassure myself that the life I had built with care still existed beyond the numbers. But the fear lingered, persistent and unwelcome. By afternoon, I forced myself to breathe deeply, to make lists, to prioritize payments, and plan my next moves. My pride burned, but survival demanded action. I needed to stabilize what I could, to protect my home and my independence, even as the betrayal of someone I loved so dearly threatened to unravel everything. Sitting back in the armchair, I realized that recovery would require more than money. It would require resolve, careful planning, and an unflinching confrontation with the truth I had spent hours trying to deny. Each ringing phone and each new notice was a reminder that there would be no shortcuts, no easy solutions, only the painstaking work of reclaiming control over a life someone else had jeopardized. By the next morning, my phone was nearly running out of space from the 64 missed calls I had left for Lila. Each time I dialed her number, my chest tightened, my fingers trembling as if the act itself were a physical strain. I imagined her seeing the notifications, feeling the weight of my desperation. Yet every call ended in silence or voicemail. I tried reasoning aloud into the phone, my voice cracking at times. "Lila, please, we need to talk. This isn't a misunderstanding. You used my card $80,000. You have to explain." The words sounded weak, even to me. I imagined her brushing them off, claiming some excuse, or worse, pretending nothing had happened. Anger churned beneath my ribs, hot and insistent, but it was intertwined with a deep, gnawing sadness. This was my daughter, the one I had raised with care, whose every milestone I had celebrated, and now she had become a stranger in my own home, someone who had taken without asking, without considering the consequences for the life we shared. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bank statements, running my hands through my hair. Should I wait for her to respond, hoping some shred of reason would surface? Or should I begin acting independently, taking steps to protect what remained of my life? Every option seemed fraught. Waiting might give her time to cover her tracks, but acting alone felt like a betrayal of hope, that perhaps she would recognize the wrong and make amends. The day stretched long and oppressive. Each missed call, each unanswered attempt deepened the pit in my stomach. I realized that words alone might not reach her, that confrontation without preparation could leave me more vulnerable. I needed clarity, evidence, and a plan before I could face her. Sinking into the armchair, I stared at the sunlight shifting across the floor, willing myself to focus, to move forward. The first step would not be confrontation. It would be gathering the proof that would make her finally accountable. Determined not to be paralyzed by fear and anger, I spent the morning preparing for a meticulous investigation. I returned to the bank, clutching my identification and my account details, explaining again and again to different representatives that I needed a full breakdown of all recent transactions. Each step required patience, forms to fill out, security questions to answer, and waiting on hold that stretched interminably. At times, it felt like the process was deliberately slow, a test of my resolve. But I refused to leave without the proof I needed. By mid-afternoon, I had a thick stack of printed statements, each line detailing charges I had never authorized: private flights, 5-star hotel suites, extravagant dinners, designer purchases, all recorded with timestamps and merchant information. I photographed each page, saved screenshots to my laptop, and organized them into folders labeled by date, amount, and vendor. The scale of the spending still made my stomach churn, but the clarity of the evidence gave me a measure of control I hadn't felt since the first alert. I reached out to a legal advisor I had worked with decades ago, explaining the situation. She listened carefully, her voice calm but firm. "Eleanor, you have clear documentation," she said. "This is actionable. We can pursue reimbursement and hold her accountable if necessary. But first, organize everything clearly and double-check for any discrepancies." Her words reinforced that preparation mattered as much as outrage. There were setbacks along the way, a delayed verification from the bank, a missing transaction receipt that had to be resent, a miscommunication that required a second visit to the branch. Each complication tested my patience, but I felt a growing determination with every resolved obstacle. For the first time in days, I sensed that the situation, though dire, was not insurmountable. Sitting at the kitchen table late that evening, I arranged the statements neatly, my hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and tension. The apartment felt quieter, almost expectant, as if it too waited for what was to come. I knew that confronting Lila would demand more than evidence. It would demand courage, composure, and moral certainty. Yet, for the first time, I felt prepared. The numbers, the receipts, the proof they were no longer just reminders of betrayal. They were my tools, my shield, and my first step toward reclaiming the life that had been threatened. I arrived at Lila's townhouse just as the late afternoon sun slanted across King Street, casting long shadows across the brick sidewalks. My hands clutched the folder of statements and screenshots, thick with the weight of every transaction, every unauthorized charge. I had rehearsed the confrontation countless times in my mind, each version ending with some measure of control, some possibility of accountability. Lila opened the door almost immediately, her smile casual, as if I were there for a friendly visit rather than the reckoning I carried in my hands. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she asked, her tone light, almost teasing. The weight in my chest tightened. I stepped inside, letting the door click softly behind me, and set the folder on the kitchen table. "I need you to explain this," I said firmly, opening the folder to reveal the printed statements. Each line of charges: private jets, luxury hotels, designer shopping was laid bare, a testament to choices I could scarcely believe were hers. $80,000. Lila, on your father-in-law's trip to Dubai, using my card. Her eyes widened, but not with fear or guilt. Instead, a flicker of defiance passed across her face. "Mom, it's not what it looks like," she said quickly, waving a hand as if the numbers on the pages were inconsequential. "He deserves luxury. He works hard. He's family." I felt my throat tighten. "Family," I echoed, voice low and steady. "Do you think that justifies taking $80,000 without asking? Do you think the years of trust, of care, mean nothing when it comes to convenience or favor?" She hesitated, shifting on her feet. But the defiance lingered. I pressed on, laying out the evidence in detail: dates, amounts, merchants, times. Each entry seemed to shrink the space between us, turning our kitchen into a courtroom where the scales of justice were balanced on honesty and accountability. Finally, silence fell. Lila's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze flicking away, no words coming. I could see her realization dawning, the moral weight settling across her shoulders as if she were measuring the consequences for the first time. I inhaled slowly, keeping my voice even, though every nerve in my body thrummed with years of love, fear, and anger. "You will take responsibility for this," I said. "I will protect what I must, and you will make amends. This is not negotiable." She swallowed, nodding slightly, her eyes avoiding mine. The confrontation was over, but the reckoning had only begun. I gathered the folder and stood, feeling the tension of the past weeks lift slightly, replaced with the sharp clarity that justice, though difficult, had a path forward. The days after the confrontation felt heavy, yet oddly clarifying. Lila remained mostly silent, retreating into her own space as the weight of the $80,000 she had spent without permission settled fully upon her. I had involved the bank and a legal advisor, not out of vengeance, but to ensure that my finances were protected and that accountability was unavoidable. Each step I took freezing accounts, verifying statements, confirming transfers was a small act of reclaiming control over a life that had been upended. In the following weeks, Eleanor kept a careful eye on her accounts, while Lila began making gradual repayments, each installment a small step toward accountability. I spoke plainly, outlining the steps she would take to make amends, to restore even a fraction of the trust she had broken. Legal consequences lingered like a shadow behind every instruction, and I did not shy from making them clear. Meanwhile, I began the slow work of restoring stability to my own life. Bills were paid, rent secured, and my savings accounted for once again. Each phone call with the bank, each email to verify account security, reinforced the sense that I could rebuild, that the chaos wrought by betrayal could be mitigated with careful action. I allowed myself small moments of relief, the first since the alert had appeared, when the weight in my chest eased enough to breathe without hesitation. Family interactions were tense. Leila and I spoke, but our conversations were measured, honest, stripped of pretense. There were no angry outbursts, no whispered resentments, only the quiet acknowledgement that boundaries had shifted irrevocably. My love for her remained, tangled with the necessity of protection and the stern insistence that actions bear consequences. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun slanted across the Charleston rooftops, I sat at the kitchen table and allowed myself a moment of reflection. The betrayal had shaken the foundations of our relationship, but it had also revealed the limits of what I could tolerate, the strength I had cultivated over decades. Recovery, I realized, was not about forgetting. It was about reclaiming agency, setting boundaries, and finding peace amid the fallout. The apartment felt quieter now, but the stillness was no longer oppressive. I had taken the necessary steps to secure my finances accounts frozen, automatic payments verified, emergency funds replenished. Each action reminded me that I was no longer vulnerable to the recklessness of someone else, not even my own daughter. I placed the thick folder of bank statements and receipts on the shelf, a tangible record of the betrayal and the steps I had taken to reclaim control. I opened my journal, the pen scratching against the paper as I wrote down the events of the past weeks. Each entry allowed me to process anger, heartbreak, and disappointment, but also to acknowledge the resilience I had discovered within myself. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to untangle emotion from action, to see clearly what had happened and how I had responded. I reflected on Leela, the daughter I still loved, now tempered by the reality of her choices. Boundaries had been set, financial, emotional, practical, and while the path to any reconciliation would be slow, the space between us was honest and grounded. I could hope for future interactions without being naive about past damage. Sitting back in my chair, I felt a quiet sense of empowerment. The fear that had gripped me the morning I discovered the $80,000 missing had diminished, replaced by clarity and agency. I was independent, prepared, and no longer defined solely by the betrayal I had endured. For the first time in weeks, I breathed deeply, letting the Charleston evening air fill my lungs. The past could not be undone, but the future was mine to navigate. Cautiously, wisely, and with a sense of freedom I had earned.